today we're talking about bad solos. Hey, I'm Schanno Johnson. If you don't know me, I'm a musician, composer, producer, and I make videos about all that fun stuff: music composition, music production. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to see videos like this in the future. So I'm a teacher. I teach middle school orchestra and middle school jazz ensemble at the moment right now. And in jazz ensemble specifically, students are often worried about sounding bad or playing a solo that sounds bad or whatever, embarrassing themselves, playing a wrong note or whatever. So one thing that I like to tell them is you have to play bad solos. You have to play a solo that sounds bad. In order to play a solo that sounds good, you have to play a solo that sounds bad. But I try to explain them because especially when they get nervous, you're scared of playing wrong notes. You're scared of getting stuff wrong and sounding bad and just looking like you don't know what you're doing in front of, all your classmates, all your friends, in front of your teacher, whatever you have there, right? But what I tell them is you have to do that in order to get to a good sounding solo. Now, I give them tricks and sort of techniques and tips on how to play solos and how to practice them and get better. I'll link a couple of videos that I've made about those same topics, but one thing that you have to do is you kind of have to do those a lot, and in the process you end up playing a bunch of solos that don't sound very good. But you kind of have to, right? In order to get to a point where you're playing a solo that sounds good, you kind of have to play all those solos that sound bad. I had a guitar teacher at high school. His name was JP. Shout out to JP. One thing he always told me that anytime you're watching somebody, whether it's improvising a solo or just playing a solo or performing, they're just showing you how much they've practiced. And that kind of stuck with me. Anytime when I was at Berkeley, for example, saw lots of people that were my exact same age, but way better than me on their instruments and could improvise solos that I wouldn't even be able to write or wouldn't even be able to play if I had learned them ahead of time. But one thing that sort of always stuck with me of you're just seeing how much they've practiced, because that's what it is. If somebody's playing a solo that sounds really good and they're improvising, they probably practiced a lot in order to get to that, right? So in order to get to that point, you have to practice a lot, right? And if you're seeing somebody that's playing really fancy solos, really fast, really sort of outlining the changes, they really know what's going on, they really know what they're doing. Yeah, they probably practiced a lot. They played a whole lot of bad solos before that. And not that it's always useful to do this, but sometimes you kind of just got to power through it, right? Once you play 100 bad solos, that 101st solo will likely be way better than your first solo, right? And when you sort of do this, you're trying to get better, you're trying to improve, you're working on specific techniques, whatever you're doing. But as you do this, you're getting better, you're practicing, you're improving, right? So remember, I tell my students this all the time. In order to play a solo that sounds good, you got to play a bunch that sound bad. Hopefully, you do all of that practicing before you have the concert. Or if it's a new song or whatever, you practice a whole bunch of solos, you play a bunch that you don't like, you keep trying to make them better, you keep trying to play stuff that you do like, and eventually you play a solo that you do like at the show, right, at the gig where you actually have to perform. Hopefully that's the case when you're doing all of this. One thing that I like to do with my students to sort of get past this sort of like nervousness and anxiety, maybe of fear of sounding bad when you play solos or improvise, is I like to have them purposefully improvise bad solos sometimes. I know that sounds really silly and I can't really say it without laughing because it sounds so terrible in the moment, but what I do, I start this myself because otherwise my students are just going to be terrified and they're not going to do this or get anything out of it. But what I do is I'll on piano or guitar, melodica, or whatever I'm using that day to play, I'll have everybody in the class play the song as if they're performing it, right? They play the melody, then add solos or whatever, and then I'll take a solo and I'll just trash everything. I will play as many wrong notes as I can, and I'll try really hard to play notes that sound really harsh so that it sounds bad, not just like I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll try really hard to make it sound gross and disgusting and terrible, but on purpose. And I make a distinction that you're not just trying to make noise, you're not just trying to, blow into your flute as hard as you can or your clarinet and just squeak or just play a bunch of clusters on piano, right? You're trying to play a solo like it sounds like you're trying to play a good solo, but it ends up sounding bad, which if you haven't tried this before, I think it's often a lot harder to do than you realize, because that means you really need to think about what you're doing in order to play it, make it sound dissonant, right? In order to play a solo that sounds really, really harsh against the chords, you have to be able to play a solo that sounds good with the chords. So in doing this, it sort of gets them out of that mindset of, oh, I'm scared of sounding bad. And I'm like, no, the assignment is to sound bad, right? You want to sound bad. And then I do it a number of times, a lot of the time, because then that loosens them up. It gets them sort of like, oh, okay, we're messing around here. It doesn't have to be good, right? I'll play a number of solos that sound bad, sound terrible. I'll try and make them sound as bad as I can, right? And then I'll have them do this. And it's a great exercise to do because, one, it gets you thinking about the chords. So you're kind of in a weird way practicing playing over the changes by playing very out of the changes. So in order to think like, okay, on this chord, I want to use, a G major 7 arpeggio. So let's work on playing an A flat major 7 arpeggio, or an A major 7, right? Or B flat major 7 or something, right? Try and play something that is outside of the changes, F sharp major 7 maybe, and you add all these notes together and they don't sound good combined, right? They sound really harsh and really dissonant, but in doing that, you need to think, what notes do I want to avoid, right? In thinking, how do I make this sound dissonant? You need to think, what notes do I not want to play? And you're sort of doing the reverse of trying to play really within the changes, and that gets you better at playing within the changes, but it also gets you sort of out of the mindset of like, oh no, I don't want to play a wrong note. What happens, everyone's going to hate me if I play a wrong note. But then you realize like, oh, it doesn't sound, it sounds bad. It doesn't sound great, right? But at the same time, you're like, I just played a solo that didn't sound very good, and that's it, right? It's not like this, world ending thing. It doesn't sort of, you don't get stuck in your head. It sort of is just like, oh yeah, okay, you just play something afterwards that sounds better. Not to bring in the old Joe Pass quote of there's no such thing as a wrong note, or whatever the quote is, but it kind of gets you in that mindset of like, oh right, if you do play something that sounds really harsh, then either do it again and then play it into a note that sounds good, or just play a note that sounds good afterwards, right? It sort of gets you thinking about playing a solo as a continuous thing rather than just specific notes over specific chords. There we go. You heard it here first. In order to get good at soloing, you have to play a bunch of bad solos. Play 100 of them, and then you might be a little bit better, I think. No, seriously. It does help to think like, oh, okay, this doesn't sound good right now, but I'm going to keep doing it, keep getting better, and eventually it'll start to sound good. You just need to remember that every time you get closer, think about that, every time you get closer to making a solo that sounds really good and is what you want to play. All right, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. Hope you learned something about music. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.